Here is something that happened to almost everyone at some point, and that almost nobody thinks about afterward. You were somewhere warm, a vacation maybe, or a house in a tropical region, or a summer evening on a porch somewhere that gets genuinely hot. And there, on the wall or the ceiling or the window screen, was a small lizard. It was doing something that should not be physically possible, walking upside down on a smooth surface with the casual confidence of an animal that has never once worried about gravity. It looked at you with those eyes. You looked at it. It blinked or didn't blink in a way that somehow felt like a judgment about your life choices. Then it caught a moth in about 40 milliseconds and disappeared into a crack. That was a gecko. And the thing is, you saw one species. One. Out of over 1,700 currently recognized gecko species distributed across virtually every warm region on Earth, occupying ecological roles ranging from tiny tree-dwelling insect hunters to large predatory geckos that eat other lizards, from species that look like dead leaves to species that appear to have been designed by someone who was given the assignment, make a lizard, but give it too much personality. 1,700 species is not a manageable number for a single video. So what follows is an exploration of the gecko world, organized by the groups and individual species that are most biologically distinct, most ecologically interesting, most surprising, or most likely to make you reconsider what you thought you knew about what a lizard can be. By the end of this, you will understand why geckos are not just wall lizards, but one of the most successful and diversified reptile lineages on the planet. And you will probably want to find one. Start with what makes a gecko, because the unifying features of this group are extraordinary enough to establish the baseline before anything else. Geckos belong to the infraorder Geckota, which is one of the major divisions within the scaled reptiles. They are distinguished from other lizards by a combination of features. Most have specialized toe pads capable of adhesion to smooth surfaces. Most are capable of vocalizing, unique among lizards, most of which are silent. Most have large eyes adapted for low light conditions, and most lack functional eyelids, instead having a transparent scale covering the eye that they clean with their tongue. The adhesion system is the most famous feature and the one that has attracted the most scientific attention. The toe pads of adhesive-capable geckos are covered in microscopic hair-like structures called setae, each of which branches into even smaller structures called spatula. These spatulae interact with surfaces at a molecular level through van der Waals forces, weak intermolecular attractions that operate at close range between the spatula tips and the surface molecules. The adhesion is dry, requires no liquid, leaves no residue, and is directional. It engages when the toe is pulled in one direction and releases when the angle changes, allowing the gecko to walk rather than stick permanently to everything it touches. The gecko adhesion system has been studied extensively for engineering applications and has inspired synthetic adhesive materials. The gecko solved a nanotechnology problem with biological structures so small they require electron microscopy to image properly. It did this through evolution, across millions of years, without any awareness that it was doing anything remarkable. The gecko is unimpressed by its own engineering. Not all geckos have adhesive toe pads. The family is diverse enough to include species with fully clawed feet adapted for terrestrial movement, and the evolutionary picture of toe pad development and loss within geckos is complex. Pads appear to have evolved multiple times in different gecko lineages rather than once in a common ancestor. This means the same solution was independently invented multiple times, which either speaks well of the van der Waals approach or says something about the strong selective advantage of being able to walk on walls. Now into the groups. The family Geckonidae is the largest gecko family, containing over 1,000 species distributed across Africa, Asia, Australia, and through introduced populations globally. Within this enormous family, several genera stand out for their distinctive biology. The house gecko, primarily Hemidactylus, with Hemidactylus frenatus being the most widespread, is likely the gecko most humans have encountered. The common house gecko has achieved a global distribution that was not accomplished through natural range expansion, but through human-assisted movement aboard ships and in cargo, colonizing tropical and subtropical regions on every populated continent. It is one of the most successful urban lizards in the world, occupying the ecological niche of indoor insect hunter in millions of human dwellings across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australia. House geckos are vocal in a way that surprises people encountering them for the first time. They produce a range of chirps and squeaks that function in social communication, territorial signaling, and possibly mate attraction. The specific vocalization patterns vary between species and populations. The name gecko itself derives from the call of gecko, the tokay gecko of Southeast Asia, which produces a distinctive two-note call that Malay speakers onomatopoetically rendered as tokay, and whose much louder call was described as sounding like gecko by early European naturalists. The entire family of over 1,700 species is named after a vocalization. The tokay gecko deserves individual attention because it is one of the most distinctive geckos in the family, reaching lengths of up to 35 centimeters and combining the visual statement of bright blue-gray skin with orange-red spots, with a personality that can only be described as aggressively confident. Tokays are known for biting and holding. They have strong jaws for a gecko and a tendency to use them on anything they consider threatening, including hands. They are beautiful, loud, large, and not particularly interested in your opinion about any of this. Leopard geckos, Eublepharis macularius, represent one of the most significant divergences from the typical gecko pattern, and this divergence is responsible for their enormous popularity in reptile keeping. Leopard geckos have functional eyelids. They can close their eyes. They can blink. This places them in the subfamily Eublepharinae, the eyelid geckos, which also lack adhesive toe pads. They are entirely terrestrial animals with clawed feet adapted for rocky, arid habitats in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Iran. The leopard gecko's native habitat is desertic or semi-desertic scrubland, and its natural history involves spending days in rock crevices and emerging at night to hunt invertebrates in conditions of low temperature that would be outside the optimal range for most lizards. Leopard geckos store fat in their tails, a thick, carrot-like appendage that swells visibly when the animal is well fed and shrinks when nutritional reserves are being metabolized. The tail is also detachable, like many lizards, and will regenerate over several months, though the regenerated tail is cartilaginous rather than bony and has a different surface texture than the original. The captive breeding of leopard geckos has produced an extraordinary diversity of color and pattern morphs, genetic variants selected for unusual coloration that would be disadvantageous in the wild but are aesthetically valued in captivity. Albino, melanistic, patternless, striped, high contrast, pastel. The captive leopard gecko population encompasses phenotypes that would be invisible in any natural setting, but constitute a kind of unintentional selective breeding experiment that has been running for several decades. Moving to what may be the most visually spectacular gecko family, Uroplatus, the leaf-tailed geckos of Madagascar. Madagascar is the setting for an improbable amount of gecko diversity, and the leaf-tailed geckos are its most extreme expression. Uroplatus species have evolved camouflage that reaches the kind of specificity usually associated with science fiction rather than natural history. The satanic leaf-tailed gecko, Uroplatus fantasticus, is named accurately. Its body mimics a dead, partially decomposed leaf with a level of detail that includes irregular margins, visible venation patterns, and coloration that replicates the brown-on-brown mottling of actual leaf litter. When this animal presses itself flat against a branch or lies motionless on the forest floor, identifying it as a living animal rather than plant debris requires sustained, dedicated looking. Uroplatus sicori takes a different camouflage approach, mimicking bark rather than leaves. Its skin has texture and coloration calibrated to the specific tree bark of the Malagasy forests it inhabits, and it flattens itself against tree trunks with a fringe of skin along its body edges that eliminates the shadow outline that would otherwise reveal it as a three-dimensional object against a flat surface. It disappears into the tree. Mossy leaf-tailed geckos of the Uroplatus ebenaui complex take this further, incorporating skin texture that mimics the irregular, fuzzy appearance of moss-covered bark. These animals are documented camouflage achievements at a level that makes other camouflaged animals look like they weren't really trying. All Uroplatus species are Malagasy endemics, meaning they exist nowhere else in the world. Madagascar's long isolation from other landmasses, it separated from the African continent roughly 88 million years ago, created evolutionary conditions where unique lineages could develop without the competition and predation pressure from continental fauna. The result is endemic wildlife found nowhere else, and the leaf-tailed geckos are among the most extreme examples. They are also, because of their beauty and rarity, heavily targeted targeted by the illegal pet trade, making several species conservation concerns despite existing in nominal protected areas. The crested gecko, Corelliphus ciliatus, was believed extinct for most of the 20th century, known only from a few museum specimens collected in the 19th century, until a rediscovery in New Caledonia in 1994 produced living animals. The timing of this rediscovery was, from a conservation standpoint, almost providential. Crested geckos were quickly established in captive breeding programs, and the captive population has since grown to millions of individuals across the pet trade globally. The crested gecko is now one of the most common pet lizards in the world, having gone from presumed extinct to globally ubiquitous within 30 years. Crested geckos, named for the fringed ridges running along their heads and bodies, are arboreal animals from the forests of New Caledonia, an island group in the Pacific. They have adhesive toe pads and a prehensile tail that assists in climbing, though the tail is not regenerated if lost in adult animals, which is a notable departure from the typical gecko pattern. Their diet in the wild includes both insects and fruit, and commercially produced fruit-based diets have made their captive care substantially simpler than most reptiles, contributing to their popularity. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The day geckos of the genus Phelsuma represent a substantial departure from the mostly nocturnal gecko pattern. Phelsuma species are diurnal, active during the day, with the enlarged pupils of nocturnal geckos replaced by small, round pupils more consistent with animals relying on visual acuity in bright light rather than sensitivity in low light. Their coloration is correspondingly spectacular. Brilliant greens, blues, and reds that serve functions in social signaling that are only meaningful to animals that are active when colors are visible. Madagascar is the primary center of Phelsuma diversity, with additional species on other Indian Ocean islands and the East African coast. The giant day gecko, Phelsuma grandis, reaching up to 30 centimeters, is the largest and most visually arresting, combining a vivid green base with red spotting and facial markings and patterns that vary between individuals and populations. Day geckos are also notable for their diet flexibility, incorporating nectar and fruit alongside invertebrate prey, making them significant pollinators and seed dispersers in their native forest ecosystems. A gecko that pollinates flowers is a gecko that deserves more credit than it usually receives. The wonder gecko, Teratoscincus species, occupies the semi-arid and arid regions from the Middle East through Central Asia, and its common name reflects the reaction it typically provokes. Wonder geckos have enormous eyes and scales that are proportionally larger than those of most geckos, arranged in an overlapping pattern that gives them a fish-like or beetle-like texture. They produce sound by rubbing their tail scales together, a stridulation mechanism different from the vocal calls of other geckos, used in threat displays, and apparently for communication. When threatened, wonder geckos inflate their bodies, elevate their tails, and stridulate, a defense strategy that combines visual and acoustic elements against predators. The banded gecko, Coleonyx species, of North American deserts represents the eyelid gecko lineage in the Western Hemisphere, with multiple species distributed across the American Southwest and Mexico. They are slender, delicate-appearing animals that are nonetheless well adapted to their arid environments, hunting small invertebrates in rocky desert terrain at night with the high-stepping, deliberate movement characteristic of animals alert to the specific thermal properties of desert surfaces after dark. The web-footed gecko, Pachydaktylus rangae, of the Namib Desert, has developed webbing between its toes that serves multiple functions in its extreme environment. The webbing allows movement across loose sand without sinking, functions as a shovel for burying the animal rapidly, and potentially assists in collecting moisture from coastal fogs that roll in from the Atlantic. This gecko licks moisture from its eyes and face during fog events, extracting usable water from what is effectively just wetness in the air. Desert survival solutions at this level of specificity represent exactly the kind of ecological fine-tuning that extended residence in extreme environments produces. The flying geckos, Tychozoon species, of Southeast Asian forests have taken the skin fringe concept to its aerodynamic conclusion. These geckos have webbing between their toes, flaps of skin along their body sides and tail, and the ability to spread these structures to increase surface area dramatically during a fall or leap from a tree. They don't fly, they glide, or more accurately parachute with some directional control. But the practical effect of reducing fall speed and allowing directional adjustment during aerial descent is functionally meaningful in a forest environment where falling from considerable heights is a regular risk. Flying geckos also, when viewed from below against a light source with all their flaps extended, look extraordinary. There is no practical reason to mention this, but it is true. The New Zealand geckos, primarily the Hoplodactylus and Nautinus lineages, represent one of the most geographically isolated gecko radiations, having been in New Zealand long enough to develop characteristics distinct from most other gecko groups. New Zealand geckos are viviparous. They give birth to live young rather than laying eggs, which is unusual for lizards generally and particularly unusual for geckos, most of which lay eggs. The cold climate of New Zealand apparently selected for live birth, which allows the mother's body temperature to be regulated in ways that protect developing embryos from the temperature fluctuations that would affect externally deposited eggs. Nautinus species, the green tree geckos of New Zealand, are diurnal, vividly green, and have a grip strength disproportionate to their size that allows them to maintain position on vegetation in the windy conditions characteristic of New Zealand habitats. They are also among the most vocal New Zealand wildlife, producing clicks and barks during social interactions. New Zealand has no native land predatory mammals. The predators are birds, and the behavioral and morphological adaptations of New Zealand's reptiles and birds reflect the specific selection pressures of an avian predator guild rather than a mammalian one. The knob-tailed geckos, Nephrurus species, of Australian arid zones have perhaps the most distinctive gecko body plan in terms of overall proportions. They have large, angular heads, rotund bodies, thin legs that seem insufficient for the body they're supporting, and tails that end in a small, bulbous knob rather than tapering. The overall effect is of an animal assembled from mismatched parts by someone working from a description rather than a reference image. They are fully functional and successful animals in their arid Australian habitats, but the aesthetic impression is irreducible strange. The largest geckos in the world, the Rhachodactylus group of New Caledonia, which includes the giant gecko Rhachodactylus leakianus, reach up to 36 centimeters, making them the largest living gecko species. Leakianus geckos have a heavy, robust build compared to most geckos, with proportionally shorter tails and a generally stocky appearance that contrasts with the slender build typical of smaller species. They are also notable for a vocalization repertoire that includes growls and hisses of unusual depth for a lizard, which has led to their incorporation into indigenous Kanak traditions as animals associated with spirits or supernatural presences in the forests they inhabit. The diversity of gecko reproductive strategies extends beyond the New Zealand live birth exception. Most geckos lay eggs, but the specific characteristics of gecko eggs differ from many other reptile groups. Gecko eggs are typically calcified, hard-shelled, rather than leathery, which is unusual in lizards and reflects either an ancestral characteristic retained from a distant common ancestor or an independent evolution of hard shelling in the gecko lineage. The eggs of many gecko species adhere to the substrate they are laid on, making them essentially immovable once positioned, a reproductive strategy that prioritizes cryptic placement over the ability to nest adjust. Some gecko species are parthenogenetic, capable of reproduction without fertilization, producing offspring that are genetic clones of the mother. Several parthenogenetic gecko species, particularly in the Lepidodactylus and Hemidactylus groups, are entirely or predominantly female, with males being rare or absent in known populations. Parthenogenesis in these species allows single colonizing individuals to establish populations on islands and other isolated habitats where finding a mate would otherwise be impossible. The parthenogenetic gecko is, in a sense, the ultimate colonizer, a single animal that can found a population, a trait that has likely contributed to the wide distribution of certain gecko species across Pacific and Indian Ocean islands. The conservation picture for geckos is complex and in many regions concerning. Island species are particularly vulnerable because island endemism means that any localized population reduction or habitat loss affects the entire global population of a species. Introduced predators, rats and cats specifically, have driven gecko population collapses on numerous Pacific and Indian Ocean islands where geckos evolved without mammalian predators. The Bovia species of New Caledonia, multiple Phelsema species of small Indian Ocean islands, and various New Zealand gecko populations have all experienced significant declines attributed to introduced predator pressure. The illegal pet trade represents a specific, targeted threat for visually spectacular species. The Europlatus leaf-tailed geckos of Madagascar, various Felsumidae geckos, and certain Rhacodactylus species are collected from wild populations for export despite legal protections, with collection pressure capable of causing localized population crashes in species that are already range-restricted. The crested gecko's recovery through captive breeding demonstrates that captive populations can relieve collection pressure on wild animals when they're well established. But this requires the captive population to be sufficiently large and the animals sufficiently appealing to maintain commercial interest without wild collection supplements. The tokay gecko faces a different and particularly troubling trade threat. Traditional medicine markets in parts of East and Southeast Asia attribute various therapeutic properties to dried tokay geckos, creating demand that has reduced wild populations in some regions significantly. The scale of the tokay trade, millions of animals annually in some estimates, represents a threat distinct from the pet trade and much harder to address through captive breeding. 1,700 species is a number that becomes more meaningful when you start encountering individual members of the group and realize how much variation those 1,700 slots contain. From the leaf-textured forest phantom of Madagascar to the gravel-colored desert specialist of the Namib, to the bright green day-active pollinator of Indian Ocean islands, to the wall-climbing urban insect hunter in your vacation hotel. These are not variations on a single theme. They are an entire world of solutions to the problem of being a small, ectothermic predator in a range of environments that extends from tropical rainforest to high-altitude desert to isolated oceanic island. The gecko on the wall in that warm place, watching you with those eyes, was carrying evolutionary history reaching back over 200 million years to the origin of the gecko, lineage in the Triassic period, before the dinosaurs diversified, before the continents reached anything like their current arrangement. It caught the moth and disappeared. It had things to do.